Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to discuss the rise of the Populist Party and bring our Gilded Age unit to a close. So here's your objectives for today, and then let's talk about the hodgepodge of different interests that came together to form one of the more successful third parties in American history. So let's talk populism and the Republican who rose to challenge them. So, a number of factors were leading to political dissatisfaction in the late Gilded Age. Farm price commodities were falling pretty substantially, which is awesome if you're, an urban dweller who buys a bunch of flour. Unfortunately, it's really problematic if you're a farmer who produces that flour because, due to the increased amount of production, and the technological increases leading to more acres being under cultivation, there's more flour in the market, but the value of it is down. So if you're a farmer who can afford to buy all of the new fancy harvesting equipment, you're probably doing okay and your income is staying somewhat constant. But if you're a small scale farmer, you're often getting pushed out by the more wealthy farmers and eventually the corporate farms that are going to start springing up throughout the old Midwest and the Western states. So, all of this together leads to hardship for farmers, coupled with the railroad monopolies that we talked about previously, squeezing out people in the West. So, especially in places like Kansas and Nebraska, these farmers were struggling, were suffering, and their incomes were falling pretty substantially. And so their goal was to join together to form first, of course, we already talked about the Grange movement, which was trying to raise the stature of farmers in people's minds. Then eventually the Farmers Alliance, which was a political alliance of farmers to try to advocate for their issues. And then eventually they're going to come together to form what's called the Populist Party. The Populists start out as Western farmers, but their goal is to build a national coalition that could theoretically actually govern. So let's talk a little bit about how they did that, what their agenda was, and why they ultimately failed. The big issue for farmers, again, was they felt like they were being controlled by Eastern interests, both railroad monopolies and other monopolies, and that they were trying to sort of warn the rest of the country that they were in the thrall of these sort of big business and trusts. And although farmers were getting squeezed now, clearly things are not going to go well for these people here in the future. So obviously, neither of the other parties really provided much relief, considering the Democrats were for, in general, lower tariffs and supported big business, and the Republicans were for higher tariffs and supported big business. And in general, within the two parties, you had factions who were more in favor of business or less in favor of business, but everyone was, for the most part, in favor of big business. And most of these battles were about personality, about patronage, and about things that honestly your average farmer in Kansas or Nebraska could care less about. So, if the two political parties are not addressing your needs, you form a third party to theoretically put together and challenge the status quo of the two parties. So, we've got these four issues here. Take a brief moment and make sure you'd understand who they're trying to pull in with each of these different groups. Okay, so hopefully you can see here that farmers are trying to pull together a coalition of farmers and laborers in order to make this party, the People's Party, be more successful and be able to outvote the sort of plutocrats that have been in charge up until this point. Unfortunately, the problem with this is the interests of farmers and workers, although they coincide on some level, there's a lot of gaps in between. And so, as this political cartoon shows, trying to put together a political party with all of these disparate interests is going to lead to a lot of holes, and it's going to be super problematic and difficult to build a governing coalition. So you combine these difficulties in unifying with the fact that the political establishment saw the populists as little more than a laughingstock. And quite frankly, they weren't helping themselves. William Peffer of Kansas here did have a ludicrously long beard, and so he made a pretty convenient target for mockery. And so in Kansas, the populists were able to succeed at most levels of government, but nationally they were seen as unwelcome outsiders and really struggled to sort of integrate themselves into the political landscape. So, what did these populists believe and actually stand for? Well, they had a whole list of things on their platform, as we talked about before. But the cornerstone of the populist platform is something called bimetallism. It's the idea that we need to supplement our current money supply by coining significant amounts of money in silver in order to raise the prices and help out farmers. So, the problem, of course, with this is although higher prices help out farmers, and this cartoon would argue also help out miners, they hurt urban workers. And so the populists were trying to put together a coalition of farmers and urban workers, but their cornerstone policy helped farmers at the expense of workers whose wages probably wouldn't rise in response to inflation. And so bimetallism was really a problematic platform. There were lots of attempts to sell it. Most famously, the book The Wizard of Oz is a populist allegory. And pause here and take a look at the various characters in order to try to understand this. But basically, the entire party going to the Emerald City is an attempt to build a populist coalition with the idea that the silver slippers were the way home all along. It sort of works. I don't know. I'm not totally convinced, but it is fun to see The Wizard of Oz in a different context. So that's bimetallism. It's a tough sell for a lot of the country. So in the election of 1892, Benjamin Harrison is going to struggle with the fact that because of the higher tariffs, the government is going to hit the largest spending mark that it's ever hit. The $1 billion Congress, as it was known, spent $1 billion for the first time ever. And in order to theoretically clean up this corrupt government, America's greatest hero and fabulous cat, Grover Cleveland, is ready to step back in and save the country. And so, at the same time, you've got a third party. So you've got Harrison as the establishment Republican, Grover Cleveland as the establishment Democrat, and for the first time and in Omaha, Nebraska, the populists nominate a candidate for president on this platform here, with the main pieces, of course, being significantly increasing the currency, theoretically a graduated income tax, and an 8-hour workday in order to try to bring together their farmer laborer coalition. It works, kind of. I'll let you take a moment to soak this in. They are able to deny either party a majority of the popular vote, and they do win some Western states and a substantial number of voters nationwide. But as you can clearly see, this is not a broad coalition, and so Grover Cleveland wins back the White House, and the populist concerns are going to be ignored. And so Cleveland becomes our only president to serve non-consecutive terms, and his second term is marred by the fact that the economy blows up in 1893. Here's Cleveland being lambasted for his support of the gold standard. You have a massive economic panic as an English banking and an English investment panic based off of like the failure of a South American railroad company. You don't need to know the details. Anyway, English panic spreads to the United States. Banks blow up, massive amounts of Western speculation ends up, this speculative bubble bursts, and Grover Cleveland is unable to deal with this. And so his 4 years in office are spent mostly not coupling or not dealing with the financial crisis, and which most people blame on England, which kind of. Also, I mean, the benefit the British have is they have a stable central banking system that can clearly pull in currency when they need to, so that's an advantage. And in the end, the lack of gold leads to a massive crisis and pushes more people into the populist camp. So, the Depression of 93 leads to a significant popular unrest. Also, one of the first large mass movements, as Jacob Coxey ends up leading a march on Washington to theoretically demand relief and free coinage of silver, and as a pseudo populist movement. And in the end, it fails because he is arrested, along with more or less everyone else, before they get to Washington. The demonstration fizzles out, and there's not a huge rising up, but it does demonstrate increasing influence of populists in national politics. So here's the news of Coxey's arrest, and his march is dispersed. In the end, J.P. Morgan bails out the United States yet again, and where the economy is able to sort of limp along into the new century, with JP Morgan having basically a blank check now to do whatever he wants. So here's JP Morgan's growing influence as he bails out the United States for the first of, I think, 3 bailouts. And the fact that a private businessman can bail out the federal government tells you a little bit about the disparity of power between the government and big business during the Gilded Age. The guy who ends up finally picking up the standard of populism, and of course being the amalgam or the inspiration for the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz, is William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska. He's a young, fiery orator, a Democratic politician who's going to take populist ideas and make it mainstream within the Democratic Party. Here he is as the Cowardly Lion, preaching his dogma or his doctrine of free silver. And so he and his massive coalition of workers, farmers, reformers, all of this, try to put together a metaphorical hodgepodge army to take on the big business establishment. And the champion of the big business establishment, so here's William Jennings Bryan one last time as the Democratic nominee. And the champion of the establishment is going to be William McKinley. This, of course, represents a substantial party realignment in the United States, as the Democratic Party, which used to be a party of, in general, small government and pro-big business, is now being swallowed up by William Jennings Bryan's populism, and they become a party of free silver and reform, at least for a time. Honestly, this is a fabulous cartoon, both because William Jennings Bryan makes a wonderful snake and because the Democratic Party looks so terrified. The election of 1896 is going to square off these two forces. William McKinley is the establishment candidate. Look, he's on a literal platform of gold in case you needed it to be spelled out any more obviously for you. There's also a divide between the two in imperialism and their support for foreign policy issues, but we're going to kick that to next unit to not muddy the waters too much and pretend like this election is just about gold. William McKinley runs his famous front porch campaign, where he does not leave his house and instead invites reporters to his home for very carefully choreographed interviews to introduce him to the American people. And in order to get these interviews out to the people, they spend just a shred more on this election, or the Republican Party does, than on previous elections. And so it might be tough to notice here, but one of these elections is a slight outlier as far as campaign spending goes. So see if you can pick it out. Obviously, the Trust did not support William Jennings Bryan and his platform of reform, and so they threw all of their money behind William McKinley. Republican strategist Mark Dollar Bill Hanna was one of the people behind McKinley and pushing his election. And so all of these powerful interests supported McKinley, whereas William Jennings Bryan barnstormed across the country, traveling something like 18,000 miles over the span of the campaign, sometimes giving up to 18 speeches a day, which makes Trump's 3 rallies a day look pedestrian. And so William Jennings Bryan constantly traveled the country speaking and campaigning in a very modern way, which, of course, during the time period was used to paint him as unsuitable for office, as is shown in this political cartoon. And to show him and he's painted as somewhat of a demagogue. His famous speech, which you read, describes the gold standard as a metaphorical cross of gold that humanity is being crucified upon. So here's William Jennings Bryan. McKinley, at the same time, is painted as somewhat of a pro-American, pro-establishment, pro-foreign, pro-expansion candidate. And, of course, they use the same arguments that they used against the populists in 92 and earlier, arguing that inflation is going to hurt American workers and erode your savings, which, fair, it probably would. So, in 1896, we see a sharply divided country. Obviously, winning the industrial North and the West is enough to get McKinley elected president. And William Jennings Bryan, despite his victories in the South, and of course the South's voting for him because, I don't know if you know this, but Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. So they're not voting for any of those pro-union Republicans. And then, of course, McKinley wins the West. Bryan wins the West, or the Western sort of Rocky Mountain states. And so with that, McKinley gets elected and populism is slapped down as big business sort of reasserts or continues to assert, I guess would be more accurate, their control over American politics. So, we're going to dive more in depth into William McKinley next unit. This will end us for this unit. But just keep in mind, he's president and not William Jennings Bryan. And so we're going to have high tariffs, we're going to have the gold standard, and we're going to start looking at former Spanish territories and thinking about whether or not we should incorporate them into our country. So that should be exciting. Stuff to look forward to. Here are your basic objectives. Hopefully, you can answer these questions, and then we'll do our writing and our test over this unit.